Hey guys, welcome back to another whiteboard video. So, had another poll in my story. This time, I had a couple options, which were adrenal insufficiency and what was the other one? Oh, the other one was common factors contributing to high blood sugar, alterations in blood sugar, which I'll do both of them. Again, I just kind of put it on my story. I'm actually kind of surprised that the blood sugar one didn't win, but this got the most votes, so we're going to tackle this one first. So some of you might be familiar with adrenal insufficiency, some of you might not. A lot of people are familiar with the term adrenal fatigue, though it's not necessarily a medical term. Adrenal insufficiency is more of a medical term. There are actually medical diagnoses that go along with it, which I'll talk about. And there is a difference in different types of adrenal issues, so I think it's important to point those out first. So typically when we think of adrenal issues, we think of stress, right? And cortisol, two main things, of course. In most people, we're looking to control cortisol, right? Because people are too stressed, they release too much cortisol, and it has negative effects, which I'll talk about down here. Potentially it can. Now, cortisol in and of itself isn't a bad thing. We need cortisol. It's a prioritized hormone in the body in that it takes priority over production of other hormones because it can keep you alive in certain situations, which I can kind of talk about that down here as well. But adrenal insufficiency, however, is going to be pretty much the opposite. It's going to be lack of production of cortisol, which you might think, oh, that's not a bad thing, but it really is, because we need cortisol to do things like weight train, right? We produce cortisol in response to getting stimulated and ready to weight train or weight training sessions. It's a great thing. Cortisol gets you going. We need cortisol for any type of fight or flight action. We need cortisol to handle any kind of stress, just to feel normal on a regular basis. You'd be surprised how often you use cortisol as a quick release tool in the body to just get you through the day and combat little things here and there. Okay, so, and it does go up and down. So cortisol typically rises in the morning. You have a waking response. It will go up, get you ready for the day. It should be lower at night in most cases, and in order to sleep, right? Okay, so let's talk about what adrenal insufficiency is a little bit more. And I mentioned that is lack of cortisol, but there are a couple types. Primary, which would be Addison's disease. This is rare. This is an autoimmune issue. This is just lack of cortisol production. These people with Addison's can have really serious conditions, really serious health issues, low blood pressure, low blood sugars, just general like extreme fatigue, have a hard time performing normal tasks, having any energy at all. Then they can actually be in danger of adrenal crisis, what they call it, where there's just a lack of cortisol production. These people can actually be at risk of death in some cases. So very serious disease, though it's not common. I personally haven't worked with anyone with Addison's disease. I've researched it, but I've never actually worked with someone that's had it. Okay. Now, a couple of these other things I have worked with. So secondary is lack of signaling, and I'll go through that down here, but essentially there's lack of signaling in order to signal the, let's see here, signal pituitary to signal the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Lack of signaling would be secondary. And if you remember the lesson on hypogonadism, talking about primary and secondary, this is kind of a similar concept. One's a signaling issue. Now, signaling issues typically boil down to things like genetics. There can be a genetic component, tumors, certain medications that can inhibit signaling pathways or disrupt signaling pathways, so that can be part of it. And there's a number of things that can happen here. Now, I have worked with a few people, or ran into a few people, I shouldn't say worked with. I did a couple consults with people that had secondary. It's an interesting thing. It's not always really by choice, right? But it's definitely very serious. I mean, it can be, in many instances, it can be just as serious as primary if left uncontrolled. These two issues here are in a lot of cases going to require medical intervention, require potentially medication. They might use a hormone replacement, like replacing with hydrocortisone. You know, so these are very serious ailments, right? Whereas we get down here, adrenal depletion, you can call this, I mean, there's a bunch of different things you could potentially call that, but essentially this is self-induced, right? So a lot of time what will happen with people is we'll start with lots of signaling, right? Lots of signaling, lots of cortisol production, high cortisol on a chronic basis, potentially start running into patterns that are off. So maybe you have lower waking cortisol and higher nighttime cortisol, which is basically just a flip-flop. You'll see that in some people. Then that can start throwing off sleep, right? Energy during the day, can't sleep at night. No energy during the day, but you can't sleep at night. It's not a good situation. Continues to manifest, right? Especially under chronic stress, and you may end up with adrenal insufficiency or cortisol depletion or adrenal depletion, and you just don't have the resources to produce the cortisol that you need to deal with situations, right? So as you can see here, short-term versus chronic. So in short term, this isn't gonna happen short term. We're equipped with the hormones and signaling pathways that we need to get through those situations. That's how we're designed. That's how we are supposed to function. We are supposed to release cortisol. It is not a bad thing, as I mentioned. So chronic, however, in chronic situations, yes, we will end up with adrenal depletion, potentially. So if you were to look at this on a test, this person would have low cortisol. This person would have low cortisol probably all day. So if any of you have followed me for a while, you'll know that I had this issue, would have been probably 2015, 2016. I had pretty bad adrenal insufficiency or adrenal depletion, and my cortisol was just flatlined. You just feel terrible. Like there's nothing that really gives you any kind of stimulation. So like other things that might, like an action movie or something, or training, like anything, you're just flat. Just because you don't have the resources to release the cortisol that you need, right? So it's a really terrible thing to feel. It's not pleasant at all. But again, that's going to be from chronic stress. Now, of course, like I said, that chronic stress can be from a number of things. I mean, we all know, and I've talked about it time and time again, how stress is not a one-dimensional thing. It happens, it comes in so many forms. I can tell you personally, at the time, I was only training 4 days a week. I was sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night. My nutrition was good. You know, all those things were right. It's just I had so much psychological and emotional stress, and of course I was training hard that I ended up here. And you think all these recovery variables were in check. Doesn't necessarily mean that you can't end up here, which I see that in people. You know, I see it in clients. Like we're of course controlling those other variables through the programming, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't become such a taxed state that your body can't keep up. Now, everyone's going to be a little more resilient or a little less resilient depending on the person. But that's essentially what's happening, okay? So if we come down here, we can look at, should be able to see that, we can look at the actual signaling pathway and what's going on. So we have the HPA axis, is essentially the system that we're looking at here, which is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, HPA, a lot easier to say. You can see hypothalamus, anterior pituitary adrenal, and signaling. So it works in a negative feedback loop. If you guys remember, well actually if you remember thyroid, if you remember the hypogonadism, like any of those, they were all working in negative feedback loops, right? So hypothalamus signals corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, to anterior pituitary, which then in turn signals ACTH here, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and then, excuse me, and then adrenal cortex will dump cortisol. Okay? Now, a couple things can happen, right? When we have too much or too little, we're going to get negative feedback loop that comes back and says, hey, increase production, or hey, slow down production, right? Just like in any of the other negative feedback loops that we talked about. Now, there are other issues. I wanted to point out just a couple common issues that come with this that aren't just necessarily related to cortisol. So just because, you know, if you have a cortisol depletion issue, or you have, you know, adrenal insufficiency, there are other disruptions in the hormone feedback loop that can occur. And here are a common one. The common one that we see is called cortisol steal, or you might see it called pregnenolone steal or progesterone steal, or there's a number of things that it could be named. However, essentially, like I said, cortisol takes priority. We need that hormone. So sometimes some of the other hormones will basically be stolen, right, to help with production. And I believe I talked about it in the episode where we talked about spotting stress on lab work. You would see how cortisol, ACTH, and progesterone were all kind of tied in, and then pregnenolone being kind of a mother hormone for DHEA and progesterone. So you go back and watch that one too. And what we can end up with is this cortisol steal where progesterone and sometimes DHEA too, and can go down, right? And then we end up with potentially estrogen dominance. Not always, but a lot of the time, because, right, what happens? That ratio of progesterone and estrogen are off. Now, I see that commonly in females that are under a lot of stress. You don't have to have adrenal insufficiency or adrenal depletion for that to happen. You cannot, even if you're not quite to this stage and you're just chronically stressed and you have high cortisol, your body's still trying to figure out how to produce more cortisol. You know, that's the goal. That's the goal. More, because you're telling your body you need it because of this chronic stress. So you end up with this cortisol steal, right? So again, you know, we may end up with estrogen dominance, low progesterone, potentially imbalance in DHEA. Those are common ones. Males maybe could end up with hypogonadism from a case like this, right? So there are a lot of other things that could go into it, right? So I talked about kind of what some of the causes would be, both involuntary, right, and more or less more voluntary. But this is, you know, this is more of a focus because this is more of what you're typically going to run into. It's not super common. I find most people don't quite get to this point, but it definitely does happen. But yes, this is definitely going to be more common than primary or secondary adrenal insufficiency. So what else can you do? I mean, the main things you can do is stress reduction, right? I mean, it's really that simple. Like I talked about my case a little bit, and it really came down to stress perception, you know, perception versus elimination, just being able to respond to stressful situations appropriately, and those things add up over time. And anyone that's done consult with me or listen to me talk about it, we talk about those things. It's some different stuff that you can do, but that's really what's going to be, you know, most important. And that's really what it boils down to. So supplementation, things like adaptogenic herbs that can help with stress response are okay. Now, if you do have adrenal depletion, be careful that you're not trying to constantly lower cortisol, right? So if any of you are interested, you can go to my YouTube channel. You go to the link tree in my Instagram bio, you can find a link to that, and just type in adrenal insufficiency. And I did some videos on that. This was a ways back. I did one on supplements, and you can look at that. I talked about some of the different supplements I was using there, but just be careful that you're not trying to just hammer your cortisol. You're not using like high doses of phosphatidylserine or something like that, where you're lowering your already low cortisol, right? So you don't want to do that. It's going to be a little bit different treatment than kind of a more short-term high cortisol situation. So this is typically something that takes longer to manifest. It's probably going to take longer to treat. Unfortunately, the reality of this situation is you're probably going to have to lessen your intensity in training, lessen your total amount of training, back all those things off for a long enough period of time to be able to let your cortisol stores and cortisol production kind of come back online. And yeah, it can take time. I mean, I know I didn't really train anything to failure for probably 4 to 5 months. Oddly enough, I looked better after that was over. Funny how that works, right? I definitely did look better at the end of it, and progressively looked better. Now I was actually getting stronger through it, even though I wasn't going to failure, and that's just because I had more energy. So, you know, it sounds kind of like a death wish, like, oh, you know, you can't train as intensely as you want stuff, but you definitely will improve in terms of your physique and everything else throughout that. You wouldn't want to be doing things like trying to do extreme fat loss phases, lots of HIIT cardio. Most repair is going to occur in a caloric surplus, so like long-term deficits and things like that, I'd be pretty careful. Tons of stimulants, you know, you're really going to want to limit stimulant intake and anything that's going to be releasing, you know, more cortisol and adrenaline and adrenal hormones, right? So that's kind of a breakdown of adrenal insufficiency, types of adrenal insufficiency, essentially what goes on, some of the potential consequences outside of just low cortisol. Talked about signaling pathways, supplementation. Like I said, feel free to go watch those other videos on my YouTube, and I hope that's helpful to everyone.